Dust, grease, and past due bills defined Arthur Briggs's miserable existence. Scraping by on nickels and dimes, he was a forgotten mechanic in a dying California desert town, watching the world speed past his rusted garage doors. But on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, the roaring thunder of a crippled Harley-Davidson shattered his quiet despair. It wasn't just any rider who rolled onto his cracked asphalt. It was a patched member of the Hells Angels, furious, stranded, and accompanied by a fragile little girl trapped in a mangled wheelchair. What happened over the next 24 hours wouldn't just defy all logic. It would summon an army of 95 outlaw bikers to completely rewrite one desperate man's destiny. Sweat dripped from Arthur's brow, stinging his eyes as he wrestled with a stripped bolt on a beat-up Ford pickup. His garage, Briggs Auto and Cycle, was less of a business and more of a graveyard for rusted metal and broken dreams. Situated on a lonely stretch of highway outside Bakersfield, California, the shop hadn't seen a profitable month in over a year. At 42, Arthur was a man hollowed out by bad luck and a recent divorce that had left him with nothing but a mountain of debt and a final eviction notice taped to his front office door. He had exactly 3 days to come up with $4,000, or the bank was taking the property, the tools, and the cot in the back room where he slept. Outside, the desert sun beat down mercilessly, pushing the temperature past 100 degrees. The silence of the afternoon was suddenly torn apart by a sound Arthur knew well, the ragged, sputtering cough of a V-twin engine gasping for its life. Arthur wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag and stepped out of the shadowy bay. A massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson panhead was limping up his driveway, trailing thick, black smoke. The man wrestling the heavy machine was a giant, standing easily 6'4", with arms like tree trunks covered in faded ink. But it was the leather vest, the kuta, that made Arthur's stomach drop. Emblazoned across the back was the notorious winged death head logo. The top rocker read Hells Angels in unmistakable red and white lettering, and the bottom rocker proudly declared California. This wasn't just a weekend warrior. This was a fully patched, heavy-hitting member of the most infamous motorcycle club in the world. The giant killed the engine, the sudden silence heavy and tense. He kicked the kickstand down with a heavy steel-toed boot and dismounted. His face was a map of hard miles and deep scars, framed by a thick, graying beard. "You the mechanic?" The biker barked, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "I am," Arthur replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Arthur Briggs. Looks like you blew a head gasket, maybe fried the stator by the smell of it." The biker scowled, ripping off his leather gloves. "Name's Jim, Big Jim. Supposed to be in Fresno by tonight for a club run, but this piece of garbage decided to eat itself alive 20 miles back." Before Arthur could respond, a battered, customized, heavy-duty pickup truck pulled into the driveway, dragging a utility trailer. The truck was driven by another man, younger, wearing a prospect patch. He parked hastily and jumped out, rushing to the passenger side of the truck. Big Jim's hardened expression instantly softened. He walked over to the truck, entirely ignoring his smoking motorcycle. "Easy, rookie. Let me get her," Jim growled at the prospect. Arthur watched in quiet surprise as the massive, intimidating biker reached into the cab of the truck and gently, with profound tenderness, lifted a young girl into his arms. She looked to be about 9 years old, her frail legs wrapped in heavy orthopedic braces. Her face was pale, framed by thin, blonde hair, and she looked utterly exhausted by the heat. "Daddy, it hurts," the little girl whimpered, burying her face into Jim's leather vest. "I know, sweet pea, I know. We're gonna get you out of this heat," Jim whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The prospect rushed to the bed of the truck and pulled out a wheelchair. Arthur's mechanic eyes instantly analyzed the chair. It was a disaster. The frame, meant to be lightweight aluminum, was bent near the right axle. The wheels were severely out of alignment. The front casters were completely shot, and the seating pad looked like it had been chewed up by a dog. It was an old, cheap model, clearly not suited for a child with complex orthopedic needs. When Jim gently set his daughter, whose name Arthur would soon learn was Lily, into the chair, she let out a sharp cry of pain. The bent frame forced her into an unnatural, agonizing posture. "Damn it," Jim muttered, slamming his fist against the side of the truck. "Chair got smashed up when the tie-down snapped in the trailer yesterday. Medical supply company in Fresno said it'd take 3 months and $5,000 to get a custom replacement." I've been trying to pad it with blankets, but it ain't working. Jim turned his intense, dark eyes back to Arthur. The vulnerability vanished, replaced once again by the intimidating glare of an outlaw. I need this bike running by tomorrow morning. I don't care what it costs. Just do it. Arthur looked at the blown-out motorcycle, then at the eviction notice on his door, and finally at the little girl gripping the armrests of her broken wheelchair, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. Leave it, Arthur said softly. I'll have the bike humming by sunrise. Can she sit in your office? Jim asked, wiping sweat from Lily's face. The truck's AC is shot, and she needs to rest while the prospect and I go find a motel that'll take us. Of course, Arthur nodded, opening the door to his dingy but air-conditioned waiting room. As Jim wheeled his daughter inside, the crooked wheels of the chair squeaked and ground against the floorboards, a sound that grated against Arthur's soul. He knew machines. He knew when a machine was hurting the person using it. I'll be back at 7 a.m., Jim stated, stepping back out into the heat. Don't mess this up, Briggs. The club is waiting on me. I won't, Arthur promised. As the truck roared off, leaving the broken Harley behind, Arthur stood in the silence of his garage. He had a massive job ahead of him with the bike, but as he glanced through the office window and saw Lily trying desperately to find a comfortable position in that mangled steel trap, a different kind of mechanical challenge began to take hold of his mind. By 9 p.m., the desert had surrendered its heat, replacing it with a biting chill. Arthur stood beneath the harsh, fluorescent lights of his garage, covered in a fresh layer of black oil. The panhead was almost done. Jim had been right about the stator, and the head gasket was blown to pieces. Fortunately, Arthur was a hoarder of vintage Harley parts. He had spent the last 5 hours meticulously tearing down the engine, replacing the damaged components, and retiming the intricate machinery. He wiped his hands on a rag, walked over to the workbench, and grabbed a lukewarm cup of black coffee. Through the glass partition of his office, he could see Lily. She had fallen asleep, her small head resting awkwardly against the cracked vinyl of the broken wheelchair. Even in sleep, her face was pinched in discomfort. Arthur walked into the office. The squeaking of his work boots didn't wake her. He knelt beside the chair, inspecting it closer. The damage was far worse than he had initially thought. The main axle was warped beyond a simple realignment. The bearings in the wheels had completely disintegrated, meaning every time she moved, it required immense physical effort. The seat pan was sagging, offering zero lumbar support for her braced spine. Arthur stood up and looked at his shop. He was losing this place in 3 days. He was entirely broke. In the corner of his garage, sitting under a tarp, was his retirement fund, a complete, pristine, custom independent suspension system, and a set of ultra-lightweight magnesium alloy wheels he had salvaged from a wrecked high-end racing quad. He had a buyer lined up in Los Angeles who was willing to pay him $3,000 for those parts, almost enough to stall the eviction. He looked at the tarp. He looked at the crippled little girl. Arthur closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. Well, he muttered to himself, a man's got to sleep at night. Moving with quiet, deliberate speed, Arthur gently lifted the sleeping Lily from the broken wheelchair and laid her down on the old but clean leather sofa in his office. He covered her with a heavy moving blanket. She curled up, finally finding a comfortable position, her breathing evening out. Arthur grabbed the empty wheelchair and wheeled it out into the main garage bay. He didn't just want to fix it, he wanted to rebuild it. He wanted to give that little girl a Cadillac ride. First, he took an angle grinder to the bent aluminum frame. Sparks rained down like fireworks in the dim garage. He completely severed the damaged sections. Next, he walked over to the tarp and pulled it back, exposing the beautiful, expensive racing suspension and magnesium wheels. Without a second thought, Arthur began disassembling the racing parts. He took the high-end, nitrogen-charged shock absorbers and began drafting a new geometry for the wheelchair frame. He needed to create a trailing arm suspension for the rear wheels, something that would absorb the shock of cracked sidewalks and rough pavement, isolating Lily's spine from the impacts. Midnight came and went. The rhythmic hum of Arthur's TIG welder echoed into the desert night. He was completely in his element, a maestro of metal. He fabricated custom mounting brackets from high-grade aircraft aluminum he had lying around. He adapted the magnesium racing wheels to fit the chair, outfitting them with smooth, rolling, high-performance ceramic bearings. By 3 a.m., his hands were bleeding, sliced open by sharp metal burrs, but he didn't stop. The frame was together, stronger and infinitely lighter than before. The independent suspension system was flawlessly integrated, but the seating was still an issue. Arthur rummaged through his upholstery supplies. He found a sheet of memory foam he had purchased to redo the seat of a classic Mustang. He cut it to size, layering it perfectly to create a bucket seat effect that would support Lily's hips and back. He covered it in soft, durable black leather, stitching it together by hand until his fingers cramped. At 5:30 a.m., the sun began to paint the eastern horizon in bruised shades of purple and red. Arthur tightened the final bolt on the chair. He stepped back, exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest. Sitting in the center of the greasy floor was a masterpiece. It looked aggressive, sleek, and utterly indestructible. The magnesium wheels gleamed. The custom shocks sat coiled and ready. The leather seat was plush and perfectly contoured. He pushed the chair lightly with one finger. It glided across the rough concrete floor as if floating on ice, completely silent. He walked over to the panhead, hooked up the battery, and kicked the starter. The massive V-twin roared to life instantly, settling into that iconic, rhythmic rumble. It was perfectly tuned. Arthur killed the engine, slumped against his workbench, and closed his eyes. He had given away his only lifeline. The shop was lost. But as he looked at the custom wheelchair, a profound sense of peace washed over him. At exactly 7 a.m., the heavy crunch of tires on gravel announced Big Jim's return. The prospect's truck pulled up, and Jim stepped out. He looked rested, but his face was still carved into a permanent scowl. Arthur was waiting by the open bay door, holding a rag over his bleeding hand. "She run?" Jim asked, not wasting time with pleasantries. "Like a top," Arthur said, gesturing to the gleaming Harley. Replaced the stator, did the head gaskets, tuned the carb. She'll get you to Fresno and back 100 times over." Jim walked over to his bike, running a massive calloused hand over the leather seat. He checked the tension on the throttle and grunted in approval. "Good work, Briggs. What's the damage?" For the bike, Arthur walked over to his greasy counter and pulled out a handwritten invoice. "Parts and labor. Let's call it $400. Jim raised an eyebrow. He knew motorcycles. He knew Arthur had just undercharged him by at least $600, but a Hell's Angel doesn't argue a cheap bill. Jim pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills, peeled off 5, and tossed them on the counter. "Keep the change." "Appreciate it," Arthur said, quietly slipping the money into his pocket. It wouldn't save the shop, but it would buy him groceries for the next month, wherever he ended up. "Where's Lily?" Jim asked, looking toward the office. "She's still sleeping on the sofa," Arthur said. "But before you wake her up, I need to show you something." Arthur walked to the back of the bay and pulled a canvas drop cloth off the newly fabricated wheelchair. Jim stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, darting from the magnesium racing wheels to the complex nitrogen shock suspension, and finally to the custom-stitched memory foam leather seat. "What the hell is this?" Jim demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Her chair was junk, Jim," Arthur said plainly, not backing down from the giant's intimidating presence. "It was hurting her. I had some spare parts lying around, made some modifications. It's got independent suspension now, ceramic bearings. It'll absorb the bumps. She won't feel a thing." Jim slowly walked over to the chair. He reached down and pushed it. Just like earlier, it glided effortlessly, totally silent. He pressed his hand into the plush leather seat. He looked at the TIG welds. Flawless, professional, structurally perfect. The massive biker turned to Arthur, his jaw tight. "You built this last night?" "I had some time while waiting for the engine sealant to cure," Arthur lied, downplaying the grueling 8 hours of labor and the sacrifice of his most valuable parts. Jim stared at him, his dark eyes piercing right through the mechanic. "How much, Briggs? Medical supply wanted $5,000 for something half this good. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Arthur said, wiping his greasy hands on his pants. "I charged you for the motorcycle, the chair. Some things you just do because they need doing. She shouldn't have to hurt just to sit down." The silence in the garage became suffocating. The prospect, who had walked in behind Jim, looked completely bewildered. No one gave a Hell's Angel something for nothing unless they were terrified, but Arthur didn't look terrified. He just looked tired. Jim stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. The tough, unbreakable outlaw exterior seemed to fracture for just a fraction of a second. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he quickly composed himself. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, sharply. Jim walked into the office and gently woke Lily. When he carried her out and set her down into the new chair, the little girl braced herself for the usual pain. But as she sank into the custom memory foam, her eyes went wide. She wiggled her hips. She leaned back. A massive, beaming smile broke across her face. "Daddy, it doesn't hurt. It feels like a cloud." Jim gripped the push handles of the chair. His knuckles were white. He looked at Arthur one last time. "You're a good man, Arthur Briggs." Without another word, Jim wheeled his daughter out to the truck. The prospect loaded the custom chair, treating it like it was made of solid gold. Jim fired up the panhead, the engine roaring with perfect precision. With a wave from Lily through the truck window, the convoy pulled out of the driveway and roared off toward the highway, leaving Arthur alone in the dust. Arthur watched them go. He reached into his pocket and felt the $500. He looked at the eviction notice on the door. He had done a good thing, a great thing, but the reality of his situation crashed back down on him. Tomorrow the bank was coming. Tomorrow he would be homeless. He locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went to the back room to sleep, convinced that his act of kindness was just a quiet, isolated moment in a cruel world. But Arthur Briggs didn't understand the brotherhood of the patch. He didn't understand that when you help an angel's family, you become blood. The next morning at exactly 9 a.m., Arthur was sitting on a milk crate outside his shop, waiting for the bank's foreclosure agent. The desert was quiet, until a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It sounded like a localized earthquake. The dust on the horizon began to churn into a massive cloud. Arthur stood up, shading his eyes from the morning sun. Down the long, straight stretch of highway, a sea of chrome and black leather was approaching. The roar was deafening, a synchronized thunder of V-twin engines. It wasn't one bike. It wasn't 10. It was an endless column of riders riding two abreast, taking over the entire highway. Arthur's heart hammered in his chest. At the very front of the pack, riding the perfectly tuned panhead, was Big Jim, and trailing behind him were 95 fully patched members of the Hells Angels, turning off the highway and pouring into Arthur's dirt driveway like a conquering army. The ground beneath Arthur's worn boots vibrated with a terrifying intensity. Dust plumed into the desert sky, creating a thick, blinding fog that swallowed the morning sun. 95 roaring V-twin engines idled in perfect, menacing unison, their chrome exhausts glinting through the haze. The Hells Angels had completely surrounded Briggs Auto and Cycle. They didn't park haphazardly. They formed a deliberate, militaristic perimeter around the perimeter of the cracked asphalt lot. Menacing figures clad in black leather, denim, and heavy boots stepped off their machines. The silence that followed the synchronized killing of 95 engines was heavier and somehow louder than the roaring exhaust pipes. Arthur stood frozen by the open bay door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had dealt with rough crowds before, but this was an entirely different stratosphere of intimidation. This was the most notorious motorcycle club on the planet, heavily organized and fiercely territorial. Big Jim strode through the sea of leather and chrome, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a man who commanded the immediate, silent respect of every biker in the lot. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a silver beard and cold, calculating gray eyes. His leather cut bore the president patch over his heart. "Arthur," Big Jim rumbled, stopping a few feet away. The hostility from the day before was entirely gone, replaced by a stoic gravity. "Told you we'd be seeing you." "Jim," Arthur managed to say, wiping his grease-stained hands nervously on a shop rag. "Bike holding up?" "Bike is perfect," Jim replied. He gestured to the older man beside him. "This is Silas, president of the California chapter." Silas extended a calloused hand, covered in faded tattoos. Arthur took it, feeling the immense, crushing strength in the older man's grip. "Jim told the table what you did yesterday, Mr. Briggs," Silas said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a judge rendering a verdict. "He told us about the suspension, the wheels, the leather. He told us you sacrificed high-end racing parts to build my goddaughter a chariot, and you didn't ask for a single dime." Arthur swallowed hard. "It was just sitting in the corner, Silas. The little girl was in pain. I know machines and I know how to make them run smooth. That's all." "In our world," Silas said, stepping closer, "a man's actions dictate his worth. The world looks at us and sees outlaws. They see criminals, but we operate on a code of respect. You showed an angel's family the highest form of respect a man can give. You bled for a little girl you didn't even know. Before Arthur could process the president's words, the shrill beep of a car horn shattered the tense atmosphere. A sleek, silver BMW sedan had pulled up to the edge of the property. The driver, a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit, was aggressively laying on the horn, demanding the bikers move their machines, blocking the driveway. This was Wallace Ford, the regional foreclosure agent for the regional bank. Wallace was a man who delighted in kicking people when they were down, known locally for ruthlessly executing evictions without an ounce of empathy. Wallace, entirely oblivious to the danger he was in, threw his door open and marched toward the garage, an eviction notice clutched tightly in his manicured hand. "Briggs!" Wallace shouted, completely ignoring the wall of 95 heavily armed bikers staring him down. "I told you yesterday was the deadline. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises before I call the sheriff to physically remove you." Silas turned his head slowly, his gray eyes locking onto the bank agent. The entire lot of bikers shifted, a collective tightening of posture. "And who might you be?" Silas asked, his voice dripping with deadly calm. Wallace stopped in his tracks, finally taking in the sheer volume of the men surrounding him. The arrogance instantly drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening pale. He looked at the patches. He looked at the faces scarred by bar fights and prison time. I am the representative of the regional bank," Wallace stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "Mr. Briggs is in default. The property belongs to the bank as of 9 o'clock this morning." Big Jim took a step toward Wallace. The giant biker looked down at the trembling man in the suit. "How much does he owe?" "That is confidential financial information," Wallace tried to assert, clutching his briefcase to his chest like a shield. Jim didn't speak. He just stared. A few bikers in the front row cracked their knuckles. The silence was agonizing. $4,000, Wallace blurted out, sweating profusely beneath the desert sun. $4,000 in arrears plus legal fees. The total mortgage payoff is $82,000, but the arrears are what triggered the foreclosure. Silas looked at Jim. Jim looked back and gave a single, firm nod. Silas reached into his leather vest and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of $100 bills. He tossed it onto the hood of Arthur's rusted tow truck. It hit the metal with a heavy thud. "That's $10,000, Silas said. Before Wallace could speak, Jim reached into his own pocket and tossed an identical stack onto the hood. 20. Then the true power of the Brotherhood revealed itself. One by one, every patched member in the front row stepped forward. They reached into their cuts, their jeans, their saddlebags. Stacks of worn, dirty, and perfectly crisp bills began piling up on the hood of the tow truck. 10,000, 20, 50. Within 90 seconds, there was a mountain of cash sitting in the desert sun. "Count it, suit," Big Jim ordered. Wallace, his hands trembling violently, stepped forward and began to quickly tally the stacks. There's over $90,000 here. 82,000 pays off the mortgage," Silas instructed, pulling a folded document from his pocket, a blank bill of sale and a lien release form he had forced a notary to stamp earlier that morning. "The rest covers your legal fees. You are going to sign the title over to Arthur Briggs right here, right now, free and clear, or I promise you, you won't be driving that fancy BMW back to your air-conditioned office today." Wallace didn't hesitate. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it twice. He signed the release, stamped it with his official bank seal from his briefcase, and handed the paperwork directly to Arthur. "Take the money and get off our property," Jim growled. Wallace furiously swept the massive pile of cash into his briefcase, nearly breaking the hinges to snap it shut. He scrambled back to his car, threw it into reverse, and sped off down the highway, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. Arthur stood perfectly still, looking down at the deed to his shop. It was fully paid off. The crushing weight of debt that had been suffocating him for 3 years vanished in an instant. Tears welled up in the mechanic's eyes, mixing with the grease on his face. "Silas." "I can't accept this," Arthur choked out, holding the paper out. "This is too much." Silas put his heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder and pushed the paper back toward his chest. "You already paid for it, brother, with blood and sweat at 3 in the morning. Briggs Auto and Cycle is yours. And as long as the California chapter breathes air, no one will ever take it from you." A massive, deafening cheer erupted from the 95 bikers. They revved their engines, the roar echoing across the desolate California landscape. Arthur wasn't just saved, He was protected, but in a town heavily controlled by corrupt local politics, that kind of protection was about to draw a very dark shadow. Over the next 3 months, Briggs' auto and cycle transformed. It was no longer a graveyard for rusted metal. It was the pulsing, mechanical heart of the Hells Angels California operations. Word had spread through the outlaw community faster than wildfire. Arthur's mechanical genius, previously wasted on cheap oil changes for passing minivans, was now dedicated to tuning high-performance American iron. He was building custom exhaust systems, dialing in race-spec carburetors, and fabricating bespoke frames for club members. The shop was thoroughly renovated. New tools lined the walls, the hydraulic lifts were repaired, and Arthur even hired 3 young apprentices to handle the volume of work flowing through his bays. He was making more money in a week than he used to make in 6 months. And every Sunday, Big Jim would ride in with Lily. Her custom wheelchair, now painted a brilliant cherry red by the club's resident artist, looked incredible. She would sit in the air-conditioned office, drinking milkshakes Arthur bought specifically for her, watching her father and the mechanic talk engines. It was an impossible miracle, but a miracle built on outlaw money rarely goes unnoticed by the law. Sheriff Mitchell Hayes had watched the resurrection of Briggs' auto with growing fury. Hayes was a corrupt, deeply entrenched lawman who ran the county like his own personal fiefdom. He had been working quietly with a commercial developer to bankrupt Arthur, intending to buy the foreclosed land at a rock-bottom price to build a massive strip mall. When the bank agent reported that the Hells Angels had paid the mortgage in cash, Hayes' lucrative under-the-table deal evaporated. Hayes despised the bikers, but he despised Arthur even more for slipping through his fingers. On a sweltering Thursday afternoon, Arthur was deep underneath a custom Dynaglide, welding a cracked frame, when the screaming wail of police sirens shattered the peace of the garage. 3 county sheriff cruisers slammed into the driveway, skidding to a halt. Dust washed over the freshly polished motorcycles waiting outside. Before the dust could even settle, Sheriff Hayes and 6 heavily armed deputies piled out of the cruisers, shotguns drawn. "Hands in the air, Briggs. Now," Hayes barked, his face red with heat and malice. Arthur dropped his welding torch and slowly raised his hands, stepping out from beneath the lift. "What's going on, Mitchell? You don't need shotguns for a noise complaint." "This isn't a noise complaint," Hayes sneered, walking up to Arthur and aggressively shoving him against the tool chest. A deputy immediately grabbed Arthur's arms, wrenching them behind his back and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're under arrest for operating an illegal chop shop, receiving stolen property, and criminal conspiracy," Hayes declared loudly, ensuring the apprentices heard every word. "Stolen property?" Arthur demanded, wincing as the cuffs cut into his skin. "Every part in this shop has a paper trail. I keep meticulous books." "Not anymore," Hayes smiled coldly. He gestured to his deputies. "Tear it apart, confiscate the ledgers, seize the computer, and impound every single motorcycle on this lot." Arthur watched in absolute horror as the deputies began to systematically dismantle his life. They weren't searching, they were destroying. They knocked over toolboxes, spilling thousands of dollars of precision instruments onto the concrete. They smashed the glass of his office door. A tow truck driven by one of Hayes' cousins pulled into the lot and began hooking up the Hells Angels motorcycles. "You can't do this," Arthur shouted, struggling against the deputy holding him. "Those bikes belong to the club. You have no warrant." "I have probable cause," Hayes whispered, leaning in close so only Arthur could hear. "You think you can bring that outlaw trash into my county and ruin my real estate deal? You're going to rot in a county cell, Briggs. And when the Angels find out the cops impounded their custom bikes while under your care, they aren't going to save you. They're going to put you in the ground." Hayes stepped back and gave a sharp whistle. "Throw him in the cruiser." As Arthur was violently shoved into the back of the sweltering police car, he looked out through the wire mesh at his ruined shop. The miracle was gone. The deputies were laughing as they loaded a massive, custom-painted Harley onto the flatbed. Arthur's heart sank to the pit of his stomach. Hayes was right about one thing. The Hells Angels did not tolerate disrespect, and losing their heavily customized $60,000 motorcycles to the local police because of a mechanic's legal trouble was the ultimate disrespect. As the cruiser pulled away, heading toward the county jail, Arthur realized he wasn't just fighting for his shop anymore. The moment Silas and Big Jim found out their bikes had been seized under his watch, Arthur Briggs would be a dead man walking. The ride to the county lockup was a masterclass in psychological torture. Tossed into the back of the sweltering sheriff's cruiser, Arthur Briggs was forced to sit on his cuffed hands, the heavy steel biting into his bruised wrists with every pothole the deputy intentionally hit. The air conditioning in the back had been shut off, turning the plexiglass divided cage into a rolling oven beneath the brutal California sun. For the first time in months, a cold, suffocating dread clawed at Arthur's chest. It wasn't just the prospect of prison that terrified him, it was the machinery of corruption Sheriff Mitchell Hayes was wielding. Hayes wasn't a lawman. He was a gangster with a badge, operating with absolute impunity in a forgotten desert county. Upon arrival at the concrete fortress of the county jail, Arthur was stripped of his grease-stained work clothes, his dignity, and his name, replaced by a neon orange jumpsuit and a booking number. They threw him into cell block D, a maximum security holding area that smelled violently of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and human despair. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach drop. He was entirely alone in a two-man cell, left to marinate in his anxiety as the hours ticked by. He knew exactly what Hayes was doing. This was the softening phase. At exactly midnight, the rattling of keys broke the oppressive silence of the block. The heavy steel door of Arthur's cell swung open and Sheriff Hayes stepped inside, accompanied by a single, hulking deputy who locked the door behind them. Hayes was out of uniform, wearing a tailored sport coat and an arrogant smirk. He carried a manila folder, which he casually tossed onto the thin, stained mattress of the lower bunk. "Comfortable, Arthur?" Hayes asked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Arthur remained standing by the rusted toilet, his jaw clenched tight. "What do you want, Mitchell?" Hayes chuckled, pulling a silver cigar case from his pocket and tapping a cigar against his palm. "I want to offer you a lifeline, Briggs, because right now you are drowning in a sea of federal charges. Racketeering, operating a chop shop, possessing stolen vehicle identification numbers. I've had my deputies plant enough doctored paperwork in your office to put you away for 20 years. You'll be an old, broken man before you ever breathe free air again." Arthur stared at him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "You're framing me because I wouldn't let the bank take my land." "Well, I am securing the economic future of this county," Hayes corrected him smoothly. "That land is zoned for commercial development. It is worth millions to the right buyers I represent. You were supposed to be evicted, Arthur. But you brought those leather-clad animals into my jurisdiction. You embarrassed me." Hayes stepped closer, the smell of cheap cologne and tobacco rolling off him. He tapped the manila folder. "Inside this folder is a quitclaim deed. You sign your property over to my holding company tonight. In exchange, the charges disappear. You walk out of here tomorrow morning with a bus ticket to anywhere else." Arthur looked at the folder, then back to the corrupt sheriff. "And the bikes? The Angels' motorcycles?" Hayes's smile turned razor-thin and venomous. "Oh, the bikes. Well, here is the beautiful part of my plan, Arthur. If you refuse to sign, I don't just send you to prison. I'm going to leave those heavily customized $60,000 machines sitting untarped in the impound yard under the desert sun. Then, my cousin at the yard is going to accidentally crush 2 of them in the compactor. And finally, I am going to leak a heavily redacted informant report to the Hells Angels stating that you sold them out to the feds to save your own skin." The blood drained from Arthur's face. The threat was crystal clear. If Hayes convinced the club that Arthur was a rat who got their prize machines destroyed, Arthur wouldn't survive his first week in state prison. The patch members inside would butcher him. "Sign the paper, Arthur," Hayes whispered, offering him a pen. "Give me the land and keep your life." Arthur looked at the pen. He thought about his empty bank account. He thought about the years of misery, the divorce, the absolute failure his life had been until Big Jim rolled up his driveway. He thought about the little girl, Lily, smiling as she sat in the custom wheelchair he built. He thought about the 95 men who had emptied their pockets onto the hood of a tow truck to save a man they barely knew. Arthur slowly reached out. He didn't take the pen. Instead, he slapped the manila folder off the bed, sending the legal documents scattering across the filthy concrete floor. "Go to hell, Mitchell," Arthur said, his voice trembling but his eyes burning with defiance. "I'm not signing away my shop, and if you touch one bolt on those motorcycles, the club won't just come for me. They will tear this entire county apart looking for you." Hayes's face contorted in pure rage. He backhanded Arthur across the jaw with devastating force, sending the mechanic crashing to the floor. The deputy immediately stepped forward, driving a heavy boot into Arthur's ribs. "Have it your way, you grease monkey piece of trash," Hayes spat, straightening his coat. "Enjoy the rest of your short, miserable life." As Hayes and the deputy stormed out, slamming the iron door shut, Arthur curled into a ball on the cold floor, coughing violently, his ribs screaming in agony. He had made his stand, but he was entirely trapped. What neither Arthur nor Hayes realized was that the county jail was not as secure as the sheriff believed. The jail housed over 600 inmates, and in the California penal system, loyalty to the winged death head ran deep. 2 cells down, a heavily tattooed inmate named Iron Mike Kellerman sat quietly on his bunk. Mike wasn't a patched member, but he was a highly respected associate who ran the contraband economy within the jail, an economy heavily subsidized by the Hells Angels. He had heard the entire exchange through the ventilation grate. He knew exactly who Arthur Briggs was. The story of the mechanic who built the president's goddaughter, a custom wheelchair, was already legendary on the streets. Mike walked over to his toilet, reached deep into the hidden plumbing cavity, and pulled out a smuggled prepaid burner phone. He dialed a Fresno area code. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Speak. It's Iron Mike down in the county cage," Mike whispered into the darkness. "You need to get a message to Big Jim and Silas. The local sheriff just dragged Arthur Briggs in here. They raided his shop, impounded the club's bikes, and the sheriff is trying to extort Briggs for the deed to his land." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Did Briggs sign?" the voice finally asked. "No," Mike replied, a hint of deep respect in his tone. "He told the badge to go to hell. Took a beating for it too. But the sheriff is planning to crush the impounded bikes and frame Briggs as a rat." "Understood," the voice said, ice cold. "Keep an eye on Briggs. Ensure nobody touches a hair on his head in that block. The club is moving." The line went dead. 150 miles north, the atmosphere inside the Hells Angels Fresno clubhouse was normally a raucous mix of loud music, clinking beer bottles, and roaring engines. Tonight, it was dead silent. Silas, the chapter president, sat at the head of a massive, scarred oak table. To his right stood Big Jim, his face a terrifying mask of barely contained, homicidal fury. Around the table sat the officers of the club, their faces illuminated by the dim overhead lighting. Hayes crossed a line. Big Jim snarled, slamming his fist onto the table, cracking the wood. "He took our bikes. He put hands on the man who saved my daughter. Give me 20 men, Silas. We ride down there, we rip the doors off that precinct, and we drag Hayes into the street." Several bikers around the table nodded in agreement, the violent energy in the room spiking to dangerous levels. "Sit down, Jim," Silas ordered, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it instantly commanded the room. Jim clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck bulging, but he obeyed his president, sinking heavily into his leather chair. "Blind rage is how you end up dead or doing life in a federal penitentiary," Silas said, looking at the men around the table. "Sheriff Hayes is a corrupt, arrogant politician who thinks he holds all the cards because he has a badge. If we attack him physically, we validate every lie he's ever told about us. The state police get involved, the feds crack down, and Arthur Briggs dies in a cell." Silas leaned forward, his cold, gray eyes calculating. "We don't play his game. We don't use crowbars and shotguns. We use his own system to break him, humiliate him, and take everything he values. We are going to bury him in paper, and then we are going to expose him to the sun." Silas reached for his cell phone and dialed a number saved simply as The Suit. At 8 a.m. the following morning, the dusty, quiet atmosphere of the county courthouse was shattered by the arrival of a sleek, black Mercedes Maybach. The man who stepped out was Richard Sterling. Sterling was the most feared, high-priced criminal defense and civil rights attorney on the West Coast. He was a shark in a $3,000 bespoke suit, a man who commanded $1,000 an hour, and whose client list included cartel bosses, Hollywood royalty, and the California chapter of the Hells Angels. Sterling didn't walk, he glided. He bypassed the metal detectors with a wave of his gold-embossed bar card and marched directly into the chambers of the presiding Superior Court judge, a man who despised Sheriff Hayes's cowboy tactics. Within 45 minutes, Sterling had secured a devastating array of legal artillery, an emergency writ of habeas corpus for Arthur Briggs, an immediate injunction against the sheriff's department preventing them from touching the impounded motorcycles, and a federal subpoena demanding all of Hayes's personal and professional communication records, citing a massive civil rights lawsuit for false arrest and extortion. While Sterling was laying waste to the local judiciary, a different kind of pressure was being applied across town. At the county impound lot, Sheriff Hayes's cousin, Earl, was sitting in his air-conditioned booth, eating a stale donut. He looked up at the closed-circuit monitors and nearly choked. The perimeter of the chain-link fence was completely surrounded. 50 patched members of the Hells Angels had arrived. They didn't rev their engines. They didn't shout. They simply parked their massive bikes in a perfect, unbroken line blocking every exit and entrance to the yard. They dismounted and stood silently at the fence, their arms crossed, staring directly at Earl's booth. Earl grabbed his radio with a trembling hand. "Dispatch, this is Earl at the yard. I need backup. They're everywhere." "Negative, Earl." The dispatcher's voice cracked over the radio, sounding panicked. "All available units are being called to the courthouse. The state attorney general's office just served a warrant on the sheriff's private office. It's a madhouse down here." Earl looked back out the window. Big Jim was standing directly at the front gate. Jim slowly raised a pair of heavy bolt cutters, let them drop to his side, and just smiled, a smile that promised absolute devastation. Earl locked the booth door, crawled under his desk, and began to cry. Back at the county jail, Arthur Briggs was sitting on his bunk, his ribs throbbing, preparing himself for the inevitable transfer to state prison. The heavy iron door of cell block D slammed open. It wasn't the hulking deputy this time. It was a terrified-looking corrections officer, accompanied by Richard Sterling. "Arthur Briggs?" Sterling asked, adjusting his silk tie. Arthur stood up slowly, wincing. "Who are you?" "I am your attorney, Mr. Briggs, retained by a mutual friend," Sterling said smoothly. "Gather your things. The charges have been completely dismissed with prejudice. You are a free man." Arthur was stunned. The transition from absolute despair to sudden freedom gave him mental whiplash. He was quickly escorted to property processing, handed back his grease-stained clothes, and walked out through the heavy double doors of the county jail. The brutal desert sun blinded him for a moment. As his eyes adjusted, he froze on the courthouse steps. Parked illegally in the VIP spot reserved for the sheriff was Big Jim's massive Ford pickup truck. Jim was leaning against the grill, his arms crossed over his leather cut. Standing next to him was Silas, smoking a cigarette, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding inside the building behind them. Arthur slowly walked down the steps, his legs feeling like lead. "Told you to keep an eye on my bike, Briggs," Jim rumbled, a rare, genuine grin breaking through his beard. "I tried," Arthur managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Hayes took everything." Hayes is currently sitting in a room with 3 federal investigators, explaining why $1 million from a commercial real estate developer was routed through his wife's bakery, Silas noted calmly, flicking his cigarette onto the concrete. "Your shop is secure. The bikes are being released as we speak. Our lawyer is going to own this county by Tuesday." Arthur looked at the 2 massive, intimidating men. He had sacrificed his livelihood, taken a severe beating, and faced decades in prison, all to protect the secrets of men he barely knew. "Why?" Arthur asked, a single tear cutting through the dirt on his cheek. "Why go through all this for a mechanic?" Silas stepped forward and gripped Arthur's shoulder, his gray eyes piercing right into Arthur's soul. "Because you didn't break," Silas said quietly. "When the badge put the boot to your neck, you didn't sell us out. You protected the club. And out here, brother, loyalty is the only currency that matters." Silas reached into his leather vest and pulled out a small, heavy piece of embroidered fabric. He pressed it into Arthur's grease-stained hand. Arthur looked down. It wasn't money. It was a custom-made patch. It didn't say Hell's Angels. It read, "Briggs Auto, Official California, Chapter Support." "You aren't just a mechanic anymore, Arthur," Big Jim said, opening the passenger door of the truck. "Your family. Let's go home." The ride back to the cracked asphalt of Briggs Auto and Cycle felt like crossing a threshold into another dimension. Arthur sat in the passenger seat of Big Jim's massive Ford, his bruised ribs aching with every shift of the gears, yet a profound, surreal calm washed over him. He kept his fingers closed, tightly, around the heavy, embroidered fabric of the support patch Silas had pressed into his hand. It was a piece of cloth, thread, and dye, but in the brutal, unforgiving landscape of the California high desert, it was absolute armor. When they pulled into the driveway, the true scope of the Brotherhood's power was laid bare. The 95 patched members had not just escorted the impounded motorcycles back from the county yard. They had taken over the property. The chaotic destruction left behind by Sheriff Hayes's deputies was already being erased. Massive, tattooed men were sweeping up broken glass, righting toppled toolboxes, and carefully organizing the scattered, expensive precision instruments. Arthur stepped out of the truck, the desert sun warm on his face. The roar of conversation and clanking metal ceased instantly. 95 men turned to look at the mechanic. Silas, the chapter president, dismounted his pristine Electra-Glide, and gave a single, sharp nod. The men went back to work. There was no applause, no dramatic speeches, just the silent, terrifying efficiency of a family protecting its own. The absolute destruction of Sheriff Mitchell Hayes occurred with a speed that left the entire county breathless. Richard Sterling, the high-priced shark of an attorney, did not just file a lawsuit. He unleashed a localized legal apocalypse. By Tuesday morning, the state attorney general, backed by federal investigators, had completely dismantled Hayes's life. The shell companies routing dirty real estate money through his wife's bakery were exposed. The commercial developers who had pressured Hayes to bankrupt Arthur panicked and turned state's evidence to save themselves. Hayes was indicted on 22 counts of racketeering, extortion, and civil rights violations. He was stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom, locked away in a federal holding facility, entirely isolated from the county he had terrorized for a decade. The local power vacuum was instantly filled by a nervous, highly compliant interim sheriff who made it a strict department policy to never, under any circumstances, harass the patrons of Briggs Auto and Cycle. Over the next 12 months, Arthur's life transformed into something unrecognizable from the miserable, dust-choked existence he had known. His garage became the undisputed mechanical sanctuary for the West Coast outlaw community. The bays were constantly filled with high-dollar custom builds, vintage restorations, and high-performance tuning jobs. Arthur hired 6 full-time mechanics, paying them a wage that allowed them to buy homes, but he remained the undisputed maestro, the final set of hands on every engine that rolled out the door. Yet despite the influx of heavy cash and absolute security, Arthur's heart remained anchored to the quiet moments. His favorite day of the week was Sunday. Every Sunday, Big Jim would ride in, the thunder of his panhead announcing his arrival miles down the highway. In the sidecar, custom-fitted and heavily padded, rode Lily. The custom wheelchair Arthur had built a year prior had done more than just alleviate her pain. The advanced independent suspension and perfectly contoured memory foam had removed the devastating micro-traumas her spine endured daily. Without the constant agony, her body was finally allowed to rest and heal. She had begun intense physical therapy, gaining muscle mass and a vibrant, healthy color in her cheeks. She was still reliant on the chair, but her spirit was entirely unbound. As her 10th birthday approached, Arthur began working late into the night, locking the doors to his private back bay. Even Big Jim was denied entry, assuming the mechanic was laboring over a high-end chopper for an elite client in Los Angeles. On a crisp Sunday morning in late October, the entire California chapter descended upon Briggs Auto. It wasn't club business. It was Lily's birthday party. The lot was packed with gleaming iron, the air thick with the smell of barbecue smoke, and the loud, booming laughter of dangerous men acting like oversized uncles. Lily sat in her cherry-red wheelchair near the open bay doors, wearing a tiny leather vest Jim had custom-ordered for her, a massive grin on her face. Arthur wiped his hands on a clean rag and walked out into the center of the lot, raising a hand. The raucous crowd slowly quieted down. Big Jim stood behind his daughter, his massive hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Lily," Arthur called out, his voice steady. "I know your dad got you a new tablet, and Silas got you enough art supplies to paint the whole town, but I had a little spare time in the back bay. Figured you might need an upgrade." Arthur gestured to 2 of his apprentices, who rolled a large object covered by a heavy canvas tarp out into the sunlight. "Pull it," Arthur said. The apprentices yanked the canvas away. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd of hardened bikers. Big Jim's jaw dropped, his dark eyes widening in absolute shock. Sitting on the concrete was a masterpiece of custom engineering. It was a miniature motorized trike, painted in the exact same flawless cherry red as her wheelchair. But this wasn't a toy. Arthur had taken a highly reliable 250 cubic centimeters engine and built a custom tubular steel frame around it. He had scaled down the trailing arm independent suspension system he designed for her chair, ensuring the ride would be as smooth as glass. More importantly, he had engineered it entirely around her physical limitations. There were no foot pedals. Everything, the throttle, the specialized high-leverage brakes, the sequential shifting, was integrated into a custom, ergonomic steering yoke operated entirely by hand. The seat was a deep, orthopedic bucket, lined with shock-absorbing gel, equipped with a 5-point racing harness to keep her completely secure. Emblazoned on the miniature gas tank was a beautiful, hand-painted white wing. Lily stared at it, her hands covering her mouth, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Uncle Arthur, is that for me?" "A biker needs her own iron, sweetheart," Arthur smiled, his own eyes glistening. Big Jim didn't say a word. He walked around to the front of Lily's wheelchair, gently lifted his daughter, and carried her to the trike. He lowered her into the deep bucket seat. Arthur stepped forward and secured the 5-point harness, adjusting it perfectly to her small frame. He showed her the hand controls, explaining the throttle and the brakes, with the patience of a father. "Turn the key, Lily," Arthur instructed. She reached out with a trembling hand and turned the ignition. The custom baffled exhaust let out a smooth, deep, throaty purr, not a deafening roar, but a powerful, steady hum that vibrated right into her chest. Lily revved the hand throttle. The engine responded beautifully. A look of pure, unadulterated freedom washed over her face. She wasn't trapped anymore. She was the pilot. Jim walked over to Arthur. The giant, terrifying enforcer of the Hells Angels pulled the grease-stained mechanic into a crushing, bone-rattling embrace. "Thank you," Jim whispered, his voice cracking with heavy emotion. "Thank you, brother." "She's family, Jim," Arthur replied, patting the giant's back. "Speaking of family," Silas called out, stepping out from the crowd. He was holding a set of keys. "We noticed your bay has been full of our bikes, Arthur. You spend all day fixing our iron, but you're still driving that rusted-out tow truck. That doesn't work for us." The crowd parted. Behind Silas sat a 1952 Harley-Davidson Panhead, perfectly restored, dripping in chrome, and painted a deep, midnight black. It was the exact model Arthur had dreamt of owning since he was a teenager. "Title's in the saddlebag, in your name," Silas said, tossing the keys to Arthur. "Now get on. The girl needs an escort for her maiden voyage." Arthur caught the keys, his heart swelling to the point of bursting. He looked at the pristine vintage motorcycle, then at the 95 outlaws who had pulled him back from the brink of total ruin. He had lost everything only to find the most fiercely loyal family a man could ask for. Arthur swung his leg over the Panhead and kicked it to life. The thunderous roar joined the smooth purr of Lily's custom trike. "Lead the way, sweet pea," Big Jim shouted, firing up his own massive bike. With a twist of her wrist, Lily rolled out onto the highway, her cherry-red trike gleaming in the sun. Arthur pulled up on her left, Big Jim on her right, and behind them, a wall of 95 roaring V-twin engines fell into perfect, synchronized formation. The dust kicked up into the California sky, not as a sign of despair, but as a monument to a miracle forged in steel, grease, and absolute brotherhood. If Arthur's incredible journey from a broken, hopeless mechanic to a fiercely protected brother of the club gave you chills, you have to hit that like button right now. This story proves that a single act of selfless kindness can trigger a tidal wave of loyalty that changes your life forever. Share this video with your friends to spread the message that true brotherhood still exists in the places you least expect it. Don't forget to subscribe and smash the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most intense, heartwarming, and unbelievable real-life stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Arthur's redemption? Let us know and keep the rubber side down.